The air in the great hall was thick with a cloying, metallic scent of sacred myrrh and crushed moon lilies. For Lyra, every breath was a gamble. Each shallow inhale sent a jagged spike of agony through her left side, where Alpha Silas's silver-tipped boot had found its mark that morning. She moved like a ghost among the gathered elite, her head bowed so low her chin brushed the rough wool of the scarf concealing her mangled throat. The Lunacy Ceremony was a display of absolute power, a symphony of dominant auras that pressed against Lyra's lungs like lead. She moved between the obsidian pillars, her trembling hands balancing a tray of ceremonial wine. She was the broken note, the mute glitch in Silas's perfect pack, and her only job was to be invisible. But as the High Elder ignited the lunar incense, the atmosphere shifted. The smoke didn't just drift, it coiled toward Lyra, smelling of ancient forests and forgotten frost. Deep beneath the layers of trauma and the silver suppressants in her blood, something long buried let out a mournful howl. Her vision splintered. The fractured ribs seemed to twist, puncturing the last of her resolves. The world tilted, the polished stone floor rising to meet her with violent speed. As the silver chalices tumbled from her grip, the ringing clatter of metal on stone was the only voice she had left. She hit the floor hard, the white moonstones staining red beneath her, and as the darkness rushed in, the sacred music of the ceremony died into a horrified, absolute silence. The heavy iron doors of the great hall were thrown back with a violent force that sent a shudder through the very foundations of the citadel. Into the sudden, suffocating silence stepped Caspian Vane. He was a vision of lethal elegance, his presence an apex predator's aura that forced every high-ranking wolf to instinctively lower their gaze. Alpha Silas stepped forward, an oily smile stretching across his face, but the words died in his throat. Caspian didn't acknowledge him. His silver eyes were fixed with terrifying intensity on the broken girl sprawled in her own blood. The king moved in a blur of predatory grace, cutting through the crowd. When he reached the edge of the moonstone dais, the unthinkable happened. Caspian Vane, the king who had never bowed to man or god, dropped to his knees. He didn't care about the crimson pool soaking into his royal furs. With a tenderness that bordered on reverence, he pulled Lyra's limp, fragile body into his lap. His head dipped to the pulse point of her scarred neck, a low, territorial rumble vibrating in his chest. "Mine," he rasped, his eyes turning abyssal black. "She is mine." The transition from the blood-stained hall to the frost-bound citadel was a blur of biting wind and the scent of Caspian's leather and spice. Within the fortress's obsidian walls, the air was sterile, humming with the low vibration of ancient wards. Lyra lay draped in silks upon a medical dais, her small frame swallowed by the opulence. The king stood like a gargoyle over the packed doctors as they scanned her throat with glowing lunar crystals. The lead physician gasped, the light refracting off the jagged scar in a sickly violet hue. It wasn't just a wound. It was an Aphony Seal, a complex weave of dark magic designed to tether her voice and her wolf. "Sire," the doctor whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at the blood analysis. "This isn't just trauma. The silver-laced iron in her system has been suppressing a lineage we thought extinct." He pointed to the crystalline structure in the vial, glowing with a faint, iridescent gold. "She isn't an omega. This is dormant royal blood, the lost melody of the moon-blessed." Caspian's jaw tightened, his hand crushing the armrest of his chair. The girl he had rescued wasn't just his mate. She was a sovereign in chains, and the quiet of the royal solar. The king's icy facade finally cracked. Caspian no longer moved with the terrifying speed of a conqueror, but with a tentative, aching softness. He sat beside Lyra's bed, his large hand resting palm up on the velvet duvet, an invitation she finally accepted. When her fingers brushed his, a spark of the mind link ignited, not a roar of power, but a gentle tide of sea mist and salt. Through the bond, Caspian felt the echoes of her stolen songs and the suffocating weight of her years in the dark. He didn't need her to speak. Her emotions flooded him like a rising ocean. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his scent of winter cedar enveloping her. "They thought they could drown your light by taking your voice," he rumbled, his voice thick with a new, dangerous devotion. "But they only made the silence loud enough for me to hear." His grip tightened slightly, a silent vow vibrating through their shared consciousness. "Rest now, my melody. When you wake, I will burn the world that tried to silence you, and from the ashes, we will build a kingdom that listens." The peace of the citadel was shattered when the heavy gates groaned under the arrival of the Obsidian Fang delegation. Alpha Silas stood in the center of the frosted courtyard, his face a mask of feigned indignation. He did not come with an apology, but with a scroll of yellowed parchment, the Blood Accord. With a sneer, he threw the document at the king's feet, claiming that Lyra was not a person, but a debt owed to his bloodline, a piece of ancestral property bound by a treaty older than Caspian's throne. Caspian looked down at the paper, his eyes turning a dangerous, abyssal black. The demand was clear: return the defective servant or face the wrath of the United Southern Pacts. To Silas, she was a tool. To the world, she was a servant. But as Caspian felt Lyra's phantom pain through their bond, he knew there was no room for diplomacy. He didn't pick up the treaty. Instead, he ignited it with a flare of his dominant aura, the ashes scattering in the freezing wind. "You claim her as property," Caspian rumbled, his voice a low promise of extinction. "I claim her as my queen. If you want her back, bring every soldier you have. I will turn your pack lands into a graveyard." In the depths of the citadel's lunar sanctuary, the silence that had defined Lyra's existence began to vibrate with a foreign, rhythmic pulse. As she pressed her palms against the cool obsidian walls, the mental fog of a decade began to thin. For the first time since the Aphony Seal was branded into her spirit, a voice that wasn't a memory flickered to life. It was a low, melodic hum, resonating from the marrow of her bones. Her wolf, long thought dead, was singing. Through this newfound connection, Lyra realized the terrifying truth of her captivity. Her silence hadn't been a defect or a punishment. It was a cage. Silas hadn't just stolen her words. He had anchored her power to her vocal cords, knowing that if she ever found her voice, the frequency of her royal lineage would shatter his control over the pack. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Every moment she had spent believing she was broken was a lie constructed by those who feared her volume. Her wolf's hum grew into a steady, defiant growl, a promise that the silence was about to end, and when it did, the sound would level mountains. The sky over the citadel bled into a bruised purple as the Obsidian Fang launched their assault. The air was no longer filled with the scent of frost, but with the acrid stench of smoke and the iron tang of war. Caspian stood at the threshold of the great gate, a whirlwind of silver and shadow, his claws rending through any who dared approach his fortress. But Silas, fueled by desperation and dark relics, struck a coward's blow. A poisoned obsidian blade sliced across Caspian's shoulder, and the indomitable king staggered, his blood splashing dark and hot against the snow. From the high balcony, Lyra watched the man who had knelt in her blood now spill his own for her sake. The sight of his vulnerability acted like a hammer against the Aphony Seal. A white-hot agony flared in her throat, more intense than any whip Marcus had ever wielded. It wasn't fear that filled her, but a primal, protective rage that scorched her veins. The internal chains of enchanted iron began to groan and snap. As she gripped the stone railing, a soundless vibration rippled out from her chest, the first hairline fracture appearing in the magical cage that had held her soul captive for a decade. The scream didn't begin in her throat. It began in the tectonic plates of her soul. As Lyra watched Silas prepare for a final, lethal strike against a kneeling Caspian, the Aphony Seal finally shattered under the sheer pressure of her grief and rage. The silence of a decade didn't just end. It detonated. The sound that ripped from her lungs was a terrifying, beautiful glass-shattering roar that physically threw back the charging soldiers. It was the lost melody returned, a frequency so pure it harmonized with the moon itself. As the sound echoed off the citadel walls, Lyra's body was consumed by a blinding, iridescent light. Her bones lengthened and snapped, shifting not into a common beast, but into the legendary Lunar Wolf, an ethereal creature of snow-white fur and eyes that glowed like twin eclipses. The battlefield went still. The very air hummed with her resonance as she landed before Caspian, a shimmering shield of divine power. Silas stumbled back, his face pale with the realization that the girl he had silenced was now the storm that would destroy him. The tides had shifted. The moon had found its voice.